You did this! You planted ideas in her head, and now look what happened." My sister Gwen was screaming at me from my front porch at 5:30 in the morning, her breath forming thick clouds in the 19-degree air. Behind her stood her husband, Bradley, his arms crossed over his chest like he was the victim in all of this. And between us, wrapped in my grandmother's quilt and still trembling despite the warmth of my living room, was 5-year-old Molly, her lips still tinged blue from the cold. "She walked here, Gwen, through the woods, in the middle of the night, in this weather." I kept my voice steady, even though everything inside me wanted to explode. "She was locked in your shed. She was being punished. Children need discipline, Heidi. Not that you would understand since you don't have any." That comment landed exactly where she intended it to. I was 32 years old, unmarried, and childless by circumstance rather than choice. But I refused to let her see me flinch. My name is Heidi, and for the past 3 years, I have lived directly across the street from my older sister and her family in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. When I first moved here, I thought it would be wonderful to be so close to family. I imagined Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, and watching my niece grow up just steps away from my door. What I got instead was a front row seat to something I never wanted to witness. I work as a veterinary technician at a local animal clinic, spending my days caring for creatures who cannot speak for themselves. Perhaps that is why I became so attuned to the silent suffering happening right across the street. Animals communicate through behavior, through body language, through the things they do when they think no one is watching. Children, I learned, are not so different. Molly had arrived at my door at exactly 5 a.m. I know because I was already awake, unable to sleep after hearing strange sounds from their property around 3 in the morning. When I opened my front door to grab the newspaper, she was standing there in nothing but thin pajamas and bare feet, her skin so cold it felt like touching ice. She was not crying. That was the part that broke me the most. She was beyond crying, her little body focused entirely on survival. "Aunt Heidi," she whispered. I got out. The lock was old. I pulled her inside immediately, wrapped her in the warmest blanket I owned, and called emergency services. Then I called Gwen and Bradley, because despite everything, I still believed in giving people the chance to explain themselves. I still believed that maybe I had misunderstood what I had been seeing for months. I was wrong. Now Gwen stood in my doorway, rage contorting her features, while her daughter sat on my couch with a cup of warm milk clutched in her tiny hands. The police were on their way. I had made sure of that before making any other calls. "You need to give her back to us right now," Bradley said, stepping forward. His voice carried that particular tone of authority that men like him use when they expect immediate compliance. "This is a family matter, and you're blowing it completely out of proportion." "She has hypothermia symptoms, Bradley. Her core temperature when I checked it was dangerously low. This is not a family matter anymore." "You checked her temperature?" Gwen laughed, but it was a sharp, ugly sound. "Playing doctor now? You're a vet tech, Heidi. You work with dogs and cats. Stay in your lane." The red and blue lights appeared at the end of our street before I could respond. 2 police cruisers pulled up, followed by an ambulance. I had requested medical attention when I called, and for once, the system was responding quickly. "What did you do?" Gwen's voice dropped to a hiss. "You called the cops on your own sister?" "I called for help, for Molly." The next few minutes were chaos. Paramedics rushed inside to assess Molly while officers separated us for statements. I watched as my niece was gently examined, her vitals checked, her little body finally beginning to warm. She kept looking at me with those enormous brown eyes, and in them I saw something I had seen building for months, but had been too afraid to fully acknowledge. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. She was not afraid of the strangers in uniforms. She was not crying for her parents. She was relieved to be away from them, and that single realization hit me harder than anything else that morning. One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached me after speaking with the paramedics. "Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight. But first, I need to know if you have any information about the child's home situation that might be relevant." I looked at Gwen, who was watching me with naked fury. Bradley stood beside her, already crafting his version of events for whoever would listen. They expected me to cover for them. They expected me to minimize, to explain away, to protect the family image the way I always had. But there was a folder in my bedroom closet, a folder I had been adding to for 6 months, a folder I never wanted to need. "Yes," I said quietly. "I have information. I have a lot of information." Growing up, Gwen was always the golden child. She was 3 years older than me, prettier according to our mother, more charming according to our father, and more likely to succeed according to everyone who met us. I learned early to accept my role as the supporting character in her story, the responsible one who cleaned up messes while she created them. When Gwen married Bradley 8 years ago, the whole family celebrated like royalty had joined our bloodline. He came from money, old Montana ranching money that had diversified into real estate and investments. He drove expensive trucks, wore designer boots, and spoke with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Our parents were thrilled. I remember my mother pulling me aside at the wedding to whisper that maybe I should try to find someone like Bradley, someone who could give me a good life. What our mother did not see, what none of us saw back then, was the way Bradley looked at Gwen when she laughed too loudly at someone else's joke, the way his hand tightened on her arm just a little too firmly, the way Gwen slowly stopped laughing altogether. Molly was born 5 years ago, and for a brief period, Gwen seemed genuinely happy. She threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else, determined to be perfect at it. But perfection is exhausting, and Bradley was not the kind of husband who helped carry the load. He expected dinner on the table, a clean house, and a wife who looked presentable at all times. The baby was her responsibility, her project, her problem when things went wrong. I moved across the street 3 years ago, after my engagement ended, and I needed a fresh start. Gwen offered me the rental property at a reduced rate, and I thought it was a gesture of sisterly love. Now, I wonder if she wanted a witness nearby, someone to validate her choices, or perhaps someone to eventually rescue her daughter when she could not. The first time I noticed something wrong was during a family dinner about 18 months ago. Molly, who was 3 at the time, accidentally spilled her juice on the tablecloth. It was a minor incident, the kind of thing that happens with small children every day, but Bradley's reaction was immediate and intense. "Take her outside until she can behave like a human being," he said to Gwen, his voice cold and measured. Gwen grabbed Molly's arm and marched her to the back porch without a word of protest. Through the window, I watched my niece standing alone in the November chill, crying silently, while we finished our meal inside. When I asked if Molly could come back in, Gwen shot me a look that said clearly to mind my own business. After that, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Molly flinched at loud noises. I noticed how she always asked permission before eating, drinking, or using the bathroom. I noticed the bruises on her arms that Gwen explained away as playground accidents, even though Molly did not attend daycare or preschool. Bradley insisted on homeschooling, which meant Molly rarely left the house or interacted with other children. 6 months ago, I made a decision. I started documenting everything I observed. Every time I saw Molly outside alone at inappropriate hours, I took a photograph with a timestamp. Every time I heard shouting from across the street, I recorded the audio. Every text message Gwen sent me complaining about Molly's behavior or asking me to watch her at odd times, I saved. I was not sure what I was preparing for, but something inside me knew that one day, this child would need someone to speak for her. The folder grew thicker each week. I included notes about Molly's physical appearance when she visited me, documenting weight loss, unexplained injuries, and her emotional state. I recorded our conversations when she would slip away to my house, seeking the warmth and safety she could not find at home. "Daddy says I'm bad," she told me once, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that children who have been told something repeatedly eventually accept it as truth. "He says bad children don't deserve nice things." "What nice things don't you deserve, sweetheart?" "Dinner sometimes. My bed when I'm really bad. I have to sleep in the cold room." The cold room. She meant the shed at the back of their property, an uninsulated wooden structure that Bradley used for storage. The idea that they were sending a child there as punishment turned my stomach. But when I confronted Gwen about it, she dismissed my concerns completely. "You don't understand parenting, Heidi. Sometimes children need serious consequences to learn. She's fine. She has blankets out there." Blankets. In a Montana winter. For a 5-year-old. I called Child Protective Services anonymously after that conversation. An investigator visited their home, but Gwen and Bradley were prepared. The house was spotless, Molly was dressed adorably, and they performed the role of loving parents perfectly. The case was closed without findings. That failure taught me something important. Authorities needed more than my word. They needed evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as a misunderstanding. So I kept documenting, kept watching, kept waiting for the moment when the truth would become undeniable. That moment came at 5 a.m. on a January morning, when Molly picked the lock on the shed door with a hairpin she had hidden in her pajamas and walked half a mile through frozen woods to reach me. She had learned to save herself because she knew no one else would. The paramedics wanted to transport Molly to the hospital for evaluation. Her temperature had stabilized, but they were concerned about potential frostbite on her toes and the lingering effects of prolonged cold exposure. I watched Gwen try to insert herself into the ambulance, insisting that she needed to accompany her daughter. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you here first," Officer Daniels said firmly, blocking her path. "The child will be well cared for. You can meet her at the hospital after we finish our conversation." "This is ridiculous. She's my daughter. You can't keep me from my own child." Bradley stepped in with his practiced calm. "Officers, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here. Our daughter was put in a timeout that got a little out of hand. She snuck out without us knowing. We would never intentionally harm her. She was locked in a shed," I said from where I stood near the ambulance. "In 19-degree weather. For how long, Molly?" The little girl looked at me, then at her parents, then back at me. Her voice was barely a whisper when she answered. "Daddy put me there after dinner. I asked for more food because I was still hungry, and he said greedy girls need to learn." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Bradley, who always had a response ready, seemed momentarily frozen. "She's lying," Gwen said quickly. "She makes things up for attention. She's always been dramatic, ever since she was a baby. Ask anyone. Ask Heidi. She knows how Molly exaggerates." All eyes turned to me. This was the moment my sister expected me to fall in line, to soften the narrative, to protect the family reputation the way I had been trained to do since childhood. Gwen's expression held both warning and pleading, a mixture that might have worked on me a year ago, but I had spent 6 months watching through my window as my niece was systematically broken down. I had listened to her describe punishments that no child should ever endure. I had photographed her wearing long sleeves in summer to hide bruises, had recorded her parents screaming at her for the crime of being a normal 5-year-old, had saved text messages where Gwen called her own daughter a burden and a mistake. "No," I said quietly. "She doesn't exaggerate. If anything, she minimizes. She's learned that telling the truth makes things worse." Gwen's face went white, then red with rage. "You traitor. After everything I've done for you, after I gave you a place to live when no one else wanted you around, this is how you repay me?" "Officer Daniels," I said, ignoring my sister completely. I have documentation that I believe is relevant to this situation. Photographs, recordings, and written observations I've been keeping for the past 6 months. I'd like to provide them to whoever is handling this investigation. Bradley stepped forward aggressively. You've been spying on us? That's illegal. Any evidence you have is inadmissible, and we'll sue you for invasion of privacy. Everything I documented was visible from public areas or told to me directly by your daughter during her visits to my home, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my pounding heart. I was careful. I consulted with a legal aid attorney 3 months ago to make sure I was doing this correctly. That detail stopped him cold. He had expected emotional reactions, impulsive behavior, something he could use against me. He had not expected methodical preparation. The ambulance departed with Molly inside, accompanied by one of the officers. The remaining officer, a younger man whose nameplate read Thompson, approached me while Officer Daniels continued speaking with Gwen and Bradley. Ma'am, you mentioned documentation. Can you retrieve it now? Yes, it's in my house, in a folder in my bedroom closet. There's also backup copies on a flash drive in my safety deposit box at the bank, and I've emailed scanned copies to myself. Officer Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. That's very thorough. I knew they would try to destroy evidence if they found out I was keeping records. Bradley has connections in this town. Money and influence. I didn't want to give him any opportunity to make this disappear. I went inside and retrieved the folder. It was thick, nearly 2 inches of paper, organized chronologically with tabs separating different types of evidence. Photographs were labeled with dates, times, and descriptions. Audio files were transcribed and accompanied by the recordings on a small USB drive. Text messages were printed with full headers showing they were authentic. My handwritten observations included specific quotes from Molly, along with my assessments of her physical and emotional state during each interaction. When I handed it to Officer Thompson, his expression shifted from professional neutrality to something more serious. This is extensive, he said, flipping through the pages. How long did you say you've been documenting? 6 months. I wanted to call for help sooner, but the first report I made was dismissed after a single home visit. I realized I needed irrefutable evidence before anyone would take action. He nodded slowly. I understand. We see this sometimes with cases involving families who present well publicly. It can be hard to break through that facade. From across the yard, I heard Gwen's voice rise in pitch. She was crying now, dramatic sobs that I recognized from our childhood. She had always been able to produce tears on command when it served her purposes. Please, she wailed. You have to believe me. My sister has always been jealous of me, of my marriage, of my beautiful daughter. She's been trying to tear my family apart for years. This is all fabricated. She's mentally unstable. I watched the officers exchange glances. They were trained to assess credibility, to notice inconsistencies, to recognize manipulation. And right now, they were seeing a mother who seemed more concerned with her own image than with her hospitalized child. Bradley put his arm around Gwen, playing the supportive husband, but his eyes found mine across the distance. In them, I saw pure hatred and a promise of retaliation. Whatever happened next, I had made enemies of my own family. But looking at that folder in Officer Thompson's hands, I knew I had also done something far more important. I had given Molly a voice when everyone else had been content to let her suffer in silence. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. I had been sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair for 3 hours, waiting for news about Molly's condition and clearance to see her. Officer Thompson had taken my documentation to the station for review, but another officer remained stationed outside Molly's room as a precaution. Gwen and Bradley arrived about an hour after I did. They sat on the opposite side of the waiting room, not speaking to me, alternating between whispered conversations and checking their phones. Bradley made several calls, stepping outside each time, and I could only imagine who he was contacting. Lawyers, probably. Maybe some of his influential friends who could help spin this situation in their favor. A social worker named Patricia approached me around 9 a.m. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried herself with the weary patience of someone who had seen too much suffering in her career. "Miss Heidi? I'm Patricia from Child Protective Services. I've been assigned to Molly's case. I understand you're the one who called emergency services this morning, and that you've provided documentation to the police." "That's correct." She sat down beside me, keeping her voice low. "I've reviewed your initial statement and some of the materials you provided. I want to thank you for being so thorough. Cases like this can be extremely difficult to pursue without substantial evidence." "I know. I made a report to your office 6 months ago. It went nowhere." Patricia's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration. "Yes, I reviewed that file as well. The investigator who handled it is no longer with our agency. Between you and me, there were concerns about the quality of his work on several cases. That explained some things, but it did not make me feel better about the months that Molly had continued suffering while I waited for the right moment to act." "How is she?" I asked. "Can I see her?" "She's stable. Some minor frostbite on 2 toes that should heal without permanent damage. She's dehydrated and underweight for her age, which the doctors are addressing. Emotionally..." Patricia paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's remarkably composed for a child who has been through what she describes. Sometimes that level of composure in trauma situations indicates a child who has learned to suppress normal emotional responses as a survival mechanism." I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing that information. "She doesn't cry much, even when she's hurt or scared. She told me once that crying makes the punishments worse." "Yes, she mentioned that to our forensic interviewer as well." Patricia glanced toward Gwen and Bradley, then back to me. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you have any reason to believe your sister or her husband might try to flee with the child, or that they might attempt to intimidate you into recanting your statements?" "Bradley has money and connections. I wouldn't put anything past him at this point." She nodded. "I've already recommended that custody be transferred temporarily while the investigation proceeds. Given the physical evidence, Molly's statements, and your documentation, I believe there's sufficient cause for emergency removal. However, I want to prepare you for the possibility that the parents will fight this aggressively." "I understand. There's something else." Patricia lowered her voice further. "In my experience, when cases involve families with resources and social standing, there's often an attempt to redirect blame. They may try to paint you as unstable, vindictive, or as having inappropriate motives for your involvement with the child. You should be prepared for that." Gwen already started. She told the police I'm jealous and mentally unstable. "Document everything from this point forward as well. Keep records of any contact they make with you, any statements they make about you publicly, anything that might constitute harassment or witness intimidation." She handed me her card. "Call me if you have any concerns or if something changes. This investigation is just beginning." A commotion from the opposite side of the waiting room drew our attention. Bradley was on his feet, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying despite his attempts to keep it quiet. "I don't care what it takes. Get him here now. This whole thing is a setup by my psychotic sister-in-law, and I need legal representation before they railroad us into something." He noticed me watching and his expression hardened. He ended the call and walked over, Bradley towering over where I sat. "You think you've won something here, Heidi? You think you're some kind of hero?" His voice was quiet but seething with barely contained rage. "When this is over, and it will be over soon, I'm going to make sure you regret every single thing you've done. That rental house you live in? Gone. The job you're so proud of? I know people on the clinic's board. Your reputation in this town? Destroyed." He leaned closer. "By the time I'm finished with you, you'll wish you'd minded your own business." I stood up slowly, meeting his eyes without flinching. The fear was there, somewhere beneath my ribs, but I refused to let him see it. Your 5-year-old daughter walked barefoot through frozen woods in the middle of the night to escape your house. Whatever you think you can do to me doesn't change that. It doesn't change what you did to her, and it doesn't change the evidence that multiple people have now seen. What evidence? Some photographs taken from across the street and recordings that were probably manipulated. My lawyers will tear that apart. Then let them try. Officer Daniels appeared beside us, her expression alert. Is there a problem here? No problem, Bradley said smoothly, stepping back. Just a family discussion. You know how emotional these situations can be. I'd recommend keeping your distance from each other until this is resolved. She looked at me with something that might have been approval. Miss Heidi, the detective assigned to the case would like to speak with you when you have a moment. Room 114 down that hallway. I gathered my things and followed her direction, feeling Bradley's glare boring into my back with every step. Whatever came next, I had made my choice. There was no going back now. Detective Angela Ruiz was not what I expected. She was younger than me, probably late 20s, with sharp eyes and a direct manner that suggested she had little patience for games. When I entered the interview room, she was reviewing my documentation folder, her expression unreadable. Have a seat, Heidi. I've been looking through what you provided, and I have to say, this is some of the most comprehensive civilian documentation I've seen in a child welfare case. You were clearly preparing for something. I was preparing for this exact situation. I knew eventually things would escalate to a point where action had to be taken. I just didn't know when or how. She set down the folder and studied me. Tell me about your relationship with your sister. The whole picture, not just the recent conflicts. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining our family dynamics, the way Gwen had always been favored, my role as the perpetual fixer and mediator, and how that dynamic had shifted when I started recognizing the signs of abuse in Molly. Detective Ruiz listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. Your sister claims you've been jealous of her your entire life, and that you're fabricating this situation out of spite. What's your response to that? My response is that I have 6 months of documented evidence and a traumatized child who supports everything I've reported. If I wanted to hurt Gwen out of jealousy, there are easier ways than spending half a year building a case file. Detective Ruiz nodded slowly. Fair point. Here's my concern. Bradley has already contacted a lawyer, one with significant experience in cases like this. They're going to argue that you coached Molly, that the documentation is manufactured or obtained illegally, and that you have a personal vendetta. I need to know if there's anything in your past, any incident they might use against you, that could undermine your credibility. I thought carefully before answering. I was engaged 3 years ago. It ended badly. My ex-fiancé told people I was controlling and paranoid, which wasn't true, but it's out there. Gwen took his side, actually. She and Bradley remained friends with him even after everything that happened. What did happen? He was cheating on me. I found evidence and confronted him. He turned it around, made me look like the unstable one for going through his things. Classic manipulation tactic. When I refused to back down, the engagement ended, and I was the villain in everyone's story. I paused. That's actually part of why I was so careful with documenting Molly's situation. I learned the hard way that the truth doesn't matter if you can't prove it. Detective Ruiz made a note. That's helpful context. Anyone else I should know about? Friends, co-workers, anyone who might be convinced to testify against your character? Bradley has influence in this town. He sits on boards, donates to causes, knows people in local government. I'm sure he could find people willing to say whatever he wants them to say. Then we need to make sure the evidence speaks for itself. She pulled out a specific photograph from the folder, one I had taken 2 months ago. It showed Molly standing in her backyard in December, wearing only a thin dress despite temperatures in the 20s. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and even from the distance, you could see the bruises on her legs. Tell me about this photo. It was December 15th. I was looking out my kitchen window around 4 p.m., and I saw Molly outside alone. She'd been out there for at least 30 minutes. I could see she was shaking. I went over and asked Gwen if I could bring Molly inside, and she said Molly was being punished for spilling paint on the carpet. I offered to help clean it, and Gwen snapped at me to stop interfering. I took that photo from my driveway after I came back home. Did you report that incident? I documented it and added it to the file. I was worried that making too many official reports would tip them off that someone was watching, and they'd either move or become better at hiding what they were doing. Detective Ruiz set the photo aside and looked at me directly. I'm going to be honest with you, Heidi. This case has the potential to become very complicated. The parents have resources to fight, and they're clearly motivated to do so. But the physical evidence from tonight, combined with your documentation and Molly's own statements, gives us a strong foundation. Child Protective Services is pursuing emergency custody removal, and based on what I'm seeing, I believe we have grounds for criminal charges. Against both of them? That's what the investigation will determine. But yes, potentially against both. A knock at the door interrupted us. Another officer poked her head in. Detective, you need to see this. The parent's lawyer arrived and he's demanding access to the child. Detective Ruiz's expression hardened. Absolutely not. She's under protective custody, and until a judge says otherwise, no one is seeing her without proper authorization. She stood up. Heidi, stay here. I'll be back. She left, and I sat alone with my thoughts. Everything was happening so fast. This morning, Molly had been a secret I was desperately trying to protect. Now her case was in the hands of investigators, lawyers were getting involved, and lines were being drawn in ways that could not be undone. My phone buzzed. A text from Gwen. You have destroyed this family. Whatever happens to you after this, you deserve it. I hope you're ready to lose everything. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of her words. She was not wrong that I would likely face consequences for what I had done. Bradley's threats about my housing, my job, my reputation were not empty. He had the means and the motivation to make my life very difficult. But then, I thought about Molly, that blue-faced little girl who had picked a lock with a hairpin and walked through freezing darkness to find safety. She had shown more courage at 5 years old than most adults display in a lifetime. If she could do that, I could face whatever came next. I saved Gwen's text message to my documentation folder. Every piece of evidence mattered now. 3 days after Molly's rescue, I received official notice that Bradley had begun eviction proceedings against me. He cited breach of rental agreement terms, claiming I had violated clauses about maintaining neighborly relationships and not engaging in activities detrimental to the property owner's reputation. It was absurd and almost certainly unenforceable, but it was also exactly the kind of harassment Patricia had warned me about. I contacted a legal aid organization that same afternoon. They assigned me a volunteer attorney named Franklin, who specialized in housing law and had experience with retaliatory eviction cases. This is textbook retaliation, Franklin said over the phone. He's trying to punish you for cooperating with law enforcement. The timing alone makes his case untenable. But that doesn't mean he won't try to drag this out and make your life miserable in the process. What should I do? Keep living there, keep paying your rent on time, and document every interaction you have with him or his representatives. Meanwhile, I'll file a response and motion to dismiss. I'll also look into whether we can pursue a harassment claim. The eviction notice was just the beginning. Within a week, I noticed strangers driving slowly past my house, sometimes stopping to take photographs. Someone had been going through my mailbox, leaving things disturbed, but not actually taking anything. One morning, I found a dead bird on my front porch, its neck clearly broken. There was no proof Bradley was responsible, but the message was clear. At work, the atmosphere shifted as well. My supervisor, a woman named Janet who had always been supportive, called me into her office with an uncomfortable expression. Heidi, I need to ask you about some things that have been brought to my attention. There are rumors circulating about your involvement in a family legal matter, and some members of our board have expressed concern about the clinic's reputation. What kind of rumors? Janet hesitated. That you've been stalking your sister's family and filing false reports with Child Protective Services. That you have a history of unstable behavior and vindictive actions against people who cross you. She held up her hand before I could respond. I'm not saying I believe any of this, but you should know that Bradley has donated significant money to this clinic over the years, and he has friends on our board. He's trying to get me fired because I reported child abuse. Is there documentation to support your side of things? Extensive documentation. The police and CPS are actively investigating. His daughter is in protective custody because of what they found when they followed up on my reports. Janet absorbed this information. I want to support you, Heidi. You're an excellent employee, and I've never seen any of the behavior these rumors describe. But I need you to understand that there may be pressure from above. If you have anything, any evidence that demonstrates you acted appropriately, I'd appreciate seeing it. I provided Janet with a summary of the situation, carefully redacted to protect Molly's privacy, but clear enough to demonstrate that my actions had been warranted. She read through it with growing concern evident on her face. This is serious. I had no idea. Most people don't. Bradley and Gwen are very good at presenting a perfect image. I'll do what I can to protect your position here. But please be careful. People with resources and something to lose can be unpredictable. I left her office feeling both grateful and uneasy. Having Janet as an ally was important, but the fact that Bradley's influence had already reached my workplace showed how far he was willing to go. That evening, Patricia called me with news about Molly. She's doing well in foster care. The family she's placed with has experience with trauma cases, and Molly seems to be responding positively. She's eating better, sleeping through the night, and starting to open up to her foster parents about her experiences. That's wonderful. Is there any update on the investigation? The police have interviewed Molly multiple times, using forensic interview protocols. Her statements have been consistent and detailed. She's described incidents going back at least 2 years, including the use of the shed as a punishment location multiple times. The medical examination found evidence of old injuries consistent with her descriptions. Patricia paused. The district attorney is preparing to file criminal charges against both parents. I sat down heavily, the weight of that information pressing on my chest. What kind of charges? Child abuse and neglect, at minimum. Possibly endangerment given the circumstances of that night. Bradley's lawyer is already pushing for lesser charges and bail, but the evidence is substantial. When? Charges should be filed by the end of this week. There will likely be a preliminary hearing within the next 2 weeks. You may be called to testify about what you observed and documented. The thought of facing Gwen and Bradley in a courtroom was daunting, but I had come too far to back down now. I'll testify, whatever you need. There's one more thing. Patricia's voice became careful. The foster family has mentioned that Molly asks about you frequently. She seems to have formed a strong attachment and feels safest when talking about visiting your house. They wanted me to ask if you might be open to supervised visits while the case proceeds. I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time since this ordeal began. Yes. Absolutely yes. Whatever I need to do, whatever paperwork or background checks are required, I'm willing. I'll start the process. These things take time, but given your involvement and Molly's clear preference, I think it can be arranged. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room and let myself feel everything I had been suppressing. The fear, the anger, the grief for the little girl who had suffered for so long while I watched and documented and waited for the right moment. The guilt that I had not acted sooner, even knowing that moving too quickly might have resulted in the case being dismissed like the first one. But mostly, I felt determination. Bradley could threaten my housing, my job, my reputation. Gwen could send hateful messages and spread lies about me to anyone who would listen. None of it changed the fundamental truth of what had happened in that house, what had been done to that child, and what I had done to finally stop it. The folder of evidence that had lived in my closet for 6 months was now in the hands of people who could actually use it. And Molly was finally safe. That was the only victory that mattered. The preliminary hearing took place on a gray February morning, 3 weeks after Molly walked through the frozen woods to my door. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more intimate, which made it harder to avoid looking at Gwen and Bradley sitting at the defense table with their expensive attorney. Bradley wore a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of wronged innocence. Gwen looked thinner than I had ever seen her, her face drawn and pale, but she still managed to shoot me looks of pure venom whenever the judge was not watching. The prosecutor, a methodical woman named Helen, walked me through my documentation piece by piece. The photographs were displayed on a screen for the court, each one accompanied by my explanation of when, where, and why I had taken it. The audio recordings were played, Gwen's voice filling the courtroom as she screamed at Molly for minor infractions, Bradley's cold pronouncements about discipline and consequences for bad behavior. "And can you explain this text message from the defendant, Gwen, dated November 12th of last year?" The message appeared on screen. "I can't deal with her anymore. She's ruining everything. Bradley says we need to be stricter, but nothing works. Sometimes I wish she had never been born." Gwen audibly gasped and turned to whisper frantically to her lawyer. Bradley's jaw tightened. "She sent this to me after I asked if she wanted me to take Molly for the afternoon," I explained. "She had been complaining about Molly's behavior for weeks, and I thought giving her a break might help." That was her response. Helen nodded. "And how did you interpret that message at the time?" "I interpreted it as evidence that Molly's parents viewed her as a burden, rather than a child who needed love and guidance. It was one of the moments that made me realize the situation was more serious than typical parenting stress." The defense attorney, a man named Lawrence with a reputation for aggressive cross-examination, rose for his turn. "Miss Heidi, you've never been married, is that correct?" "That's correct. And you don't have any children of your own?" "No." "So your understanding of appropriate parenting practices comes from where, exactly? Veterinary school?" Helen objected, and the judge sustained it, instructing Lawrence to rephrase. "Let me put it differently. What qualifies you to determine that another parent's discipline methods constitute abuse?" I met his eyes steadily. "I don't need parenting credentials to know that locking a 5-year-old in an unheated shed in January temperatures is abuse. I don't need a degree to recognize that a child should not have visible bruises on a regular basis. And I certainly don't need qualifications to understand that when a little girl walks barefoot through freezing woods rather than stay in her own home, something is terribly wrong." Lawrence tried a different approach. "You were jealous of your sister's successful marriage and comfortable life, were you not? Isn't it true that your own engagement ended in failure 3 years ago?" "My engagement ended because my fiancé was unfaithful. That has nothing to do with what I witnessed happening to Molly." "But isn't it convenient that your documentation began right after your sister hosted a dinner party where your ex-fiancé was present with his new partner?" I paused, genuinely confused. "I don't know what dinner party you're referring to. I wasn't invited to any social events at my sister's home after my engagement ended." Lawrence checked his notes, clearly thrown. He had expected a different reaction. "No further questions," he said shortly, returning to his seat. Helen approached the bench with a final piece of evidence. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit testimony from the child's pediatrician, who will confirm that he reported concerns about Molly's weight loss and frequent injuries to Child Protective Services on 2 separate occasions. But both reports were dismissed after home visits found no immediate danger." The judge reviewed the documentation. "This is admitted. We'll hear from the pediatrician this afternoon." During the lunch break, I sat alone in the hallway, trying to eat a sandwich I had brought from home. A shadow fell across me, and I looked up to see Gwen standing there, her lawyer nowhere in sight. "I hope you're happy," she said quietly. You've destroyed everything. Our marriage is falling apart. Our daughter is living with strangers. And Bradley is talking about filing for divorce to distance himself from the charges. Gwen, you locked your daughter in a shed. She almost died of hypothermia. She was fine. She's always been dramatic and manipulative, just like you. If you had stayed out of it, we would have worked through our problems as a family. You would have killed her. Maybe not that night, but eventually. The escalation was clear. Gwen's face contorted. You know nothing about being a mother. Nothing about the pressure, the expectations, the constant failure. She was impossible, and Bradley's standards were impossible, and I was drowning. But instead of helping me, you built a case against me. I tried to help. You refused. You told me to mind my own business. I needed support, not judgment. Molly needed protection, not parents who saw her as an inconvenience to be punished into compliance. Gwen stared at me for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been recognition of truth or simply deeper hatred. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The trial concluded 3 weeks later with a verdict that made headlines across Montana. Bradley was found guilty of child abuse and criminal negligence, sentenced to 5 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 3. Gwen received a lesser sentence of 2 years, with the judge citing evidence that she had been operating under duress from Bradley's control of the household. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of their downfall. Bradley's business partners moved quickly to distance themselves once the conviction became public. Real estate deals were canceled, investment opportunities evaporated, and the social circles that had once welcomed him closed their doors. His family's legacy, generations of respected ranching and business success, was permanently tarnished by association with child abuse. The divorce he had mentioned to Gwen became reality, filed from his prison cell. In it, he blamed her entirely for their situation, claiming he had been unaware of the extent of her treatment of Molly. It was a lie, contradicted by the very evidence that had convicted him, but desperation makes people rewrite history. Gwen was released after 18 months, her sentence reduced for good behavior. But she returned to a life that bore no resemblance to what she had lost. The house was sold to pay legal fees. Her former friends wanted nothing to do with her. Our parents, who had initially tried to support her, eventually could not reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the woman who had locked their granddaughter in a freezing shed. I saw her once, about 6 months after her release, in the grocery store. She was thinner than ever, her hair streaked with gray that had not been there before, and she was buying the cheapest generic brands with hands that shook slightly as she counted out cash. Our eyes met across the aisle. I expected anger, blame, perhaps another accusation of betrayal. Instead, I saw something worse. Emptiness. The realization that everything she had valued, the image, the status, the comfortable life, had been built on a foundation of cruelty and control, and when that foundation crumbled, there was nothing left. She turned away without speaking. I did not follow. The real victory, though, was not in watching my sister and her husband face consequences for their actions. It was in watching Molly slowly come back to life. I had applied for foster certification 2 months after her removal, going through background checks, home inspections, and training courses. Patricia had been my advocate throughout, helping navigate the bureaucratic maze with patience and persistence. By the time the trial concluded, I was approved as Molly's foster parent, and she moved into my home on a rainy April afternoon. She was hesitant at first. Trust, once broken in a child so young, does not rebuild easily. She flinched at loud noises, hoarded food under her bed, and spent the first week testing boundaries to see if punishment would follow. When it did not, when I responded to accidents with understanding instead of anger and to misbehavior with conversations instead of isolation, she began to relax in ways I had never seen. The first time she laughed freely, really laughed, we were making pancakes together on a Saturday morning. She had gotten flour on her nose, and I had pretended not to notice until she caught her reflection in the toaster. The sound of her laughter filled my kitchen, and I had to turn away so she would not see me crying. We developed routines, school drop-offs and pickups, homework at the kitchen table, bedtime stories that she picked from a growing collection on her shelf. Slowly, the hyper-vigilant child who had arrived at my door turned into something closer to a normal 6-year-old, complete with strong opinions about her wardrobe, a preference for chicken nuggets over almost everything else, and an emerging passion for drawing that filled our refrigerator with colorful artwork. 6 months after she moved in, I began the process of adoption. The parental rights termination had been finalized after the convictions, and there were no other family members willing or able to take custody. Molly was legally free to be adopted, and I was ready to make our family official. When I told her, explaining as simply as I could what adoption meant, she was quiet for a long moment. "So you would be my real mom?" she asked finally. "I would be your legal mom. But honestly, Molly, I've felt like your mom since the night you showed up at my door. The paperwork is just making it official." She considered this. "But I could still call you Aunt Heidi if I want. You can call me whatever feels right." She nodded seriously. "I think I'll call you Mom, but sometimes Aunt Heidi, when I remember the before times." "That sounds perfect." The adoption was finalized on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 2 years after Molly had walked through frozen woods to find safety. The courtroom this time felt different than the one where her parents had been sentenced. This one was bright, decorated with balloons by the clerk who had seen us go through every step of the process. Molly wore a purple dress she had picked out herself, and she held my hand tightly as the judge reviewed our paperwork and asked the final questions. "Molly, do you understand what's happening today?" "Yes, Your Honor. Heidi is becoming my real mom." "And is that what you want?" Molly looked up at me, and her smile was the answer before her words confirmed it. "More than anything." The judge signed the papers, declared us officially mother and daughter, and the small group of people who had supported us through everything burst into applause. Patricia was there, along with Janet from my work, Franklin the attorney who had fought off Bradley's eviction attempt, and Detective Ruiz, who had become something like a friend over the course of the investigation. Afterward, we went to Molly's favorite restaurant for lunch, a small diner that served the chicken nuggets she loved alongside pancakes all day. She chattered happily about school, about her upcoming birthday party, about the puppy she hoped we might adopt next. Normal things. The concerns of a normal child living a normal life. I watched her and felt the full weight of everything we had been through settle into something peaceful. The fear and anger that had driven me through months of documentation, through threats and harassment, through a trial that exposed my family's darkest secrets, had transformed into something quieter. Not quite forgiveness, perhaps never that, but something like resolution. Gwen would spend years trying to rebuild a life from the ashes of her choices. The last I heard, she had moved out of state, working minimum-wage jobs and struggling to establish anything resembling stability. Bradley would serve his full sentence after parole was denied following disciplinary incidents in prison. Neither of them would ever be permitted contact with Molly, a court order that would remain in effect until she turned 18 and could make her own decisions. Our parents eventually reached out, tentatively and with obvious shame. They wanted to know their granddaughter, wanted to be part of her life now that the truth could no longer be denied. I let Molly decide, and she chose to meet them, with me always present, in slow, carefully supervised encounters that might someday become something warmer. Healing, I learned, does not follow a straight line, and forgiveness is not required for moving forward. The documentation folder that had started this entire journey now lived in a fireproof safe in my closet, alongside the adoption papers and other important documents. Sometimes I thought about burning it, destroying the evidence of that dark chapter forever. But something always stopped me. Perhaps because it served as a reminder of what had been necessary, what had been possible, and what had ultimately been worth every sleepless night and terrifying moment. Standing in my kitchen on a quiet evening, watching Molly do homework at the table where I had once spread out photographs and recordings and handwritten observations, I thought about how life rarely unfolds the way we expect. I had never planned to be a mother. I had certainly never planned to build a legal case against my own sister. But Molly had needed someone to fight for her, and I had been the only one willing to see what was right in front of everyone's eyes. The folder in that safe was evidence of suffering, yes, but it was also evidence of something else. Of choices made when staying silent would have been easier. Of courage that did not feel like courage at the time, only like necessity. Of love that had grown from watching a small child endure what no child should ever experience, and deciding that enough was enough. Molly looked up from her math worksheet and caught me watching her. "What?" she asked, a hint of her old wariness flickering before being replaced by the trust we had built together. "Nothing, just happy." She smiled, that full genuine smile I had worked so hard to earn, and returned to her homework. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season, turning the world soft and quiet and clean. Whatever came next, we would face it together, as a family. The months of secret documentation, the terror of confrontation, the long battle through courts and investigations, it had all led to this moment of perfect, ordinary peace. And looking at my daughter, safe and warm, and finally able to just be a child, I knew I would make every single choice again, without hesitation. Some fights are worth everything they cost. This one had been worth more.